the NFC South starting at the bottom. You have New Orleans at 5-12 last year. I don't think it's a secret to say that this team needs just about everything, but the major question is, and we can address that before we get to the more granular stuff, because I can talk all day about how they need help on the defensive interior, how, you should probably have something to kind of backstop your safety position long term, how you need help in the offensive interior. But what the hell's going on with Derek Carr? Are they going to have to draft a quarterback at number 9?
I mean, it's just a weird situation in general. Yeah. Like, going back to the beginning of the offseason where he, I think that there was some question like over whether or not Kellen was pushing his chips into the middle of the table with Derek, and, coming from Derek's camp. Then I think Derek's camp wanted a raise. Then, like, do they want to trade? And that became an issue. Then the Saints do the conversion without really working with Carr. Now that was their right, because they have the automatic conversion in the contract. But like, I think that sort of, that was sort of another salvo in this whole thing. So it hasn't been in a good place. The injury is 2 years old, so right. Like, this isn't something that's new. It's an injury he suffered in 2023. And so like, it just feels like they're in a cold war right now. And like, maybe he doesn't want to play there. And they are holding their ground on it. And we'll see what happens. I mean, I don't know that Mickey Loomis is going to be backed into a corner and forced to do anything. That said, I do not think it's going to be Shedeur Sanders at 9. If it's a quarterback, I think it'd be Jackson Dart. That would be my guess. And that's a guess based on a bunch of things I've tried to put together here. And I don't know that would be at 9. I think that could be, they could be looking at quarterback in the second round, but they've done a ton of homework on the quarterbacks, as they should, because of the situation they're in. And this predates the injury, obviously, or whatever, with Derek Carr. I just don't know. I don't know at what point they're going to take a quarterback, but my guess would be they take a quarterback somewhere in the first 3 rounds. And they do have 4 picks in the first 3 rounds with the pick they got from Washington for Lattimore.
And Spencer Rattler, baby. Yeah. Don't forget about Spencer Rattler. He had some snaps last year. I think if you take that out of it, corner is a desperate need. I think that you need help with your interior offensive line and really to replenish a lot of that unit. And you need another wide receiver. You need defensive interior. Like, in a nice way. I mean, you say Mickey Loomis not threatened. I mean, if a GM hasn't been knocked off of the pedestal by this point, he's probably not going anywhere, right? And so you could go wherever you want in the draft because the roster's so bad that you need help at almost every position.
Yeah, they have a lot of work to do. And obviously it's a new system coming in too. So, you have to start to look specifically at what Brandon Staley is going to want on defense and what Kellen Moore is going to want on offense. And I think one thing that's interesting about the defensive piece of this is, like, I do think Staley is going to want movable pieces, guys that he can kind of mix and match, and, guys who are versatile. So at 9, who would that be? I have Jalen Walker in my head. I don't think he's going to make it to them, but I have Jalen Walker in my head as somebody who's kind of like one of those movable pieces where you could do a ton of different things with him. Maybe the same way in that same sort of defense, Vic Fangio moves Zach Bond around. Like, he could be that sort of player. And then the defensive backs, like, I'll bring up Jedi Barron again as a guy who's kind of like this flexible defensive back that you could do a ton of different things with. The South Carolina safety is sort of interesting too, if you consider how well Staley did with Derwin James. I just don't know. I think that'd be a little early to pull the trigger on him.
I think knowing him and knowing how everything went down in LA, I think, your first, second, and third instinct is get me a secondary. I need, I need some help. Carolina Panthers next, also 5-12. Little intrigue that they're picking 8, and then the division rival Saints are picking 9. They've done a lot of work over the last 2 years in really shoring up this offensive line, and especially the interior of the offensive line, to make Bryce Young a little bit more comfortable. I think that the layperson might sit there and say, well, Xavier Legette isn't enough weapons-wise. Can you get him some more? But, I mean, this team is invested. I mean, you took draft picks at the tight end position last year, Legette.
Oh, and you're forgetting our internal evaluation of Jalen Coker.
Yeah, massive Coke heads here, and one of the best undrafted free agents in the NFL last year. I just thought did a phenomenal job developing him, and has the relationship with Bryce, which I think is important. I think the one thing, because for so many years you've held on to Ejiro Evero, you believe in him as a coordinator, I think it's time to invest on that side of the ball. I think you need an edge, you need safeties, you need corners, you need defensive interior. I mean, it's nice again, but it's also an issue for Carolina when your best defensive your best front seven player is Jadeveon Clowney right now.
I was just going to say that, like, you have crying needs on defense. Like, I would not mind it if, again, I think I'm looking at the picks now. They have 5 in the top 114. I wouldn't mind if it was a clean sweep for defense here. They've invested a lot in the offense. They got the offense going. What's going to help Bryce Young is
Tyreek Hill. Just kidding.
What's going to help Bryce Young is playing with shorter fields.
Yeah.
Closer games, that aren't, not being behind by 20. Like, that'll help Bryce Young too. And so I think getting Evero the help that he needs on defense is, it's got to be a huge focus. And this is another team that I've heard for Jalen Walker. And that would make some sense. Again, like, Evero's got like the Vic Fangio roots, the same way Brandon Staley does. And I think Jalen Walker is that sort of player where you can do a bunch of stuff with him on your defensive front. And, from a character standpoint, is like a plus kid, and I've had some teams say that he's like a defensive coordinator in the pre-draft meetings. So he would make a lot of sense for them at 8.
Rounding it out with the Falcons and the Buccaneers at the top of this division. And Atlanta, I think a lot of these teams show us where they want to go in free agency, because Leonard Floyd isn't the end-all be-all here at edge, even though there's the relationship with Raheem Morris, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember last year everyone saying, well, they're going to go get Dallas Turner because they need help at edge, and then they ended up shoring up the quarterback position instead. And so I think edge is probably a position of need there. And cornerback, to the point where I would wonder about Raheem Morris reuniting with Jalen Ramsey, if that's possible.
That would make some sense. Like, I think, honestly, like, I look at this, like, there's not a more clear need outside of maybe Tennessee and quarterback in the NFL. There's not a more clear need than the Falcons and edge rusher. I feel like this has been a problem for them forever. They gave up a 3rd-round pick to get Matthew Judon last year. They signed Leonard Floyd, like you said. To me, it's like, do you let the board come to you, or this to me would be a team that could move up? Now I think what makes it a little bit more difficult is, like I said, like, they've sort of drained their draft pick supply, so they've only got 3 picks in the first 6 rounds, which is a tough spot to be in. So you might be talking about trading future assets, which I think makes this whole thing really difficult. But whether it's if like a Shamar Stewart or a Mikael Williams gets them, then maybe it's easy. Like, do you view Mike Green from Marshall or Donovan Ezeraku from Boston College? Do you view those guys as reaches at that point? They're kind of up against it at that position, and I could see where they have to get creative and make a short move up for one of the guys, or maybe if they feel like one of these guys is a reach, maybe they drop down a few spots to take him in a place that's more suitable.
15, 46, 118, 218, 242. So not a ton of capital here for Atlanta. And I would say that's another team where the GM is in a very serious spotlight. Would you put Raheem Morris in that same position? I don't necessarily know, just because, the GM's been there for a little bit longer and has had some time to put this roster together. Last, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers closing out our draft needs series. Albert, as you know, I've always been a major supporter of this organization and believe in everything.
That's why you saved him for last.
And I believe in everything that they've ever done. Another example of just a team that I think probably tells you a little bit about what they feel like their own needs are.
Yeah.
In free agency, you try to take that flyer on Hassan Reddick on the edge. I don't think that necessarily takes you away from drafting an edge, but this is a Todd Bowles defense. It's a Todd Bowles team, and so I would guess that replacing that foundational off-ball linebacker spot is a huge, huge need for them. I would guess cornerback is a huge, huge need for them. I would guess that they want another safety to play next to Winfield Jr. That would be my thought process going into this one.
Yeah, I would say corner, edge rusher or two to really look at, and I think, so somebody mentioned this to me that they've struck out like on traits guys like Joe Tryon, and like looking for like, okay, like here's a big, fast, physical kid that hasn't produced that we can mold, and that they may lean a little bit more with the edge rushers on production. And that's where Ezraku's names come up pretty, like a couple people brought up Ezraku's name for me, to me there. And I think he would make some sense just as a guy who, again, checks the character box and all of that, but also like was a very productive collegiate player. And that's why like I look at them like versus like, so like Shamar Stewart and Mikael Williams, we've talked a lot about the edge rushers, right? Like those two guys, like I think you're betting on the come with them, where it's like those guys look like they were built in a lab to play defensive end, right? Versus like an Ezraku who maybe doesn't have all of that, but it's a little bit more productive. So that's what I would look at for them. Maybe both with the edge rushers and even with the corners, So, if a Will Johnson or a Jedi Barron makes it to them, are you reaching on the Ole Miss corner probably at that point, right? Like, but I think, I see it for them as like let's go get like a kid who's been productive in college that probably defensively can help us, and like for one reason or another, Ezraku is the name that's kind of continued to come up with them.
I mean, they're gonna win this division again. They're just going to, and I think this team drafts well.
For 5 in a row now, right?
Yeah, and
that was preceded by a Super Bowl championship.